My name is Van, and I've always been fascinated by the stories we tell ourselves about the past. When we picture the Wild West, our minds usually jump straight to the Hollywood version. We see stoic gunslingers, high-noon shootouts, and grizzled prospectors striking it rich with a lucky swing of a pickaxe. It's a world of outlaws, gold rush fortune hunters, and epic cattle drives across sweeping landscapes. We think of fame, fortune, and the untamed freedom of the frontier. But that's just the highlight reel. The sizzle without the steak. The real story, the one most folks lived, wasn't nearly as glamorous. For the vast majority of people trying to carve out a life in that unforgiving territory, daily existence wasn't about chasing fame or dodging bullets in a saloon. It was about endurance. It was a relentless, day-in, day-out battle against the elements, against hardship, and against the sheer grinding reality of starting from scratch. Forget quick-draw duels. The real fight was against a spoiled crop, a lame horse, or a roof that wouldn't stop leaking. This was a world where the simplest things we barely even think about today were monumental, often disgusting, and sometimes life-threatening challenges. Think about it. From cooking a simple meal to washing your clothes, from getting around to just staying alive in brutal, unpredictable conditions, every single task was a job. A hard job, a dirty job. There were no shortcuts, no conveniences, and certainly no one to call when things went sideways. You were the plumber, the mechanic, the doctor, and the grocer, all rolled into one. Your survival depended not on how fast you could draw a pistol but on how resourceful, how tough, and how willing you were to get your hands dirty. Very, very dirty. So, saddle up, and let's put the romantic myths aside for a while. We're going to travel back in time, but not to the saloons and showdowns. We're heading to the outhouses, the kitchens, and the dusty trails to see what life was like. We're about to discover 10 everyday things that were totally, completely, and often, unpleasantly different in the Wild West. This is the story of the grit behind the glory, and trust me, it's a story worth telling. Let's get to it. Alright, let's start with something we all do, but nobody really wants to talk about. The call of nature. Today it's a trivial matter. You excuse yourself, walk down a climate-controlled hallway to a porcelain throne, and you're done. It's clean, private, and utterly unremarkable. But out on the frontier, this simple biological function was an adventure in itself, and not the fun kind. There was no such thing as indoor plumbing. The very idea would have sounded like a fairy tale. For most folks, the solution was the iconic and often dreaded outhouse. This wasn't some quaint rustic shack you see in folksy paintings. It was a small, crudely built wooden structure, usually set a good 50 to 100 feet from the main cabin for reasons that will become painfully obvious. It was a box, perched over a hole in the ground, that's it. In the blistering heat of summer, the stench rising from that pit was a force of nature. It was an eye-watering, stomach-turning miasma that clung to the air and attracted every fly for miles around. You learned to hold your breath and make the trip as quick as humanly possible. And if the summer was a trial by smell, the winter was a trial by ice. Imagine waking up in the middle of a blizzard, the wind howling and the temperature plummeting below zero. You've got to bundle up in every layer you own just to make that frigid trek through knee-deep snow. The seat, often just a splintery wooden plank, would be so cold it felt like it could fuse to your skin. It was a punishing, miserable experience that made you question every life choice that led you to that particular windswept plain. The cold was a physical assault. But the fun didn't stop there. What about toilet paper? Forget it. That was a luxury far, far in the future. People had to get resourceful, using whatever was on hand and, well, disposable. The most common option was the humble corn cob, surprisingly effective, I'm told, though I'm not eager to confirm. Dried leaves, handfuls of grass, or old newspapers were also popular choices. If you were lucky, you might have pages from an old Sears Roebuck catalog, which served as both reading material and, later, a practical solution. It wasn't glamorous, but it was life. Making that trip to the outhouse was bad enough in broad daylight, but what about at night? Or during a violent thunderstorm when the sky was cracking open, venturing out into the pitch-black darkness, with who knows what, rustling in the tall grass, wasn't just unpleasant, it could be downright dangerous. This is where the chamber pot came in. It was the low-tech, indoor alternative, and while it solved one problem, it created a whole new set of aromatic challenges for the household. It was a necessary evil, a compromise with convenience. A chamber pot was exactly what it sounds like, a simple ceramic or metal pot, kept under the bed or in a corner of the room. When nature called in the dead of night, you didn't have to face the cold or the dark. You just used the pot. Of course, this meant the pot and its contents were now sharing the same small, often single-room cabin with the entire family. Privacy was a concept that simply didn't apply. You did your business, often with others sleeping just a few feet away, and tried to ignore the obvious. The morning after brought a new chore, one that nobody wanted, but someone had to do. The chamber pot didn't empty itself. It was usually the job of the women or older children to take the pot outside and dump the contents. Where? Well, not too close to the well, you hoped. It might get chucked into a ditch, a designated slop pile, or sometimes just flung out into the yard. This wasn't just a frontier problem. Even in growing towns, the streets were often open sewers, a testament to the universal challenge of waste disposal before modern plumbing. So you have this daily cycle of filth and function, the freezing or sweltering trips to the outhouse by day, and the less than private use of the chamber pot by night, followed by the morning's grim disposal duty. It was a constant, unpleasant reality of life. It's a stark reminder that the good old days were often smelly, unsanitary, and filled with tasks that would make most of us turn green. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't clean, but it was the way things were done. It was a dirty job, and everyone had a part to play. We live in a world of instant gratification. If you need something from the store, you hop in your car and you're there in 10 minutes. A trip across the state is a matter of a few hours on a smooth, paved highway. But in the Old West, the very concept of a quick trip was pure fantasy. There were no highways, no rest stops, and certainly no gas stations. The world was a much bigger place back then, and every journey, no matter how short it seems to us, was a significant undertaking that required planning, patience, and a whole lot of grit. If you lived on a homestead and needed to go to the nearest town for supplies, you didn't just decide to go on a whim. You prepared for an expedition. This meant hitching up the wagon, a process that could take a good chunk of time in itself, and loading up for what was likely a full-day journey, assuming the town was relatively close. For families living further out on the plains, a round trip for flour, salt, and nails could easily turn into a multi-day ordeal, forcing you to camp out under the stars along the way. Wagon travel was the backbone of frontier life, but it was brutally slow and grueling work. You were moving at the speed of a walking horse or ox, maybe 3 or 4 miles an hour on a good day, but good days were rare. A single trip could be derailed by 100 different problems. A sudden downpour could turn a dry dirt track into a sea of impassable mud, swallowing your wheels up to the axles. You might have to cross a swollen river with no bridge, a terrifying prospect that could end with your entire wagon and all your precious supplies being swept away. And then there were the breakdowns. A broken wheel in the middle of nowhere was a catastrophe. You couldn't just call for a tow truck. You had to have the tools, the materials, and the know-how to fix it yourself, right there on the trail. Your horses and mules weren't just transportation. They were your lifeline. They were precious, essential assets. Losing an animal to injury, sickness, or exhaustion could leave you completely stranded, miles from any help, with your family's survival hanging in the balance. Every mile was earned. The challenges of getting around weren't just mechanical or logistical. The environment itself was an active adversary. The open plains, while beautiful in their own way, were notoriously unforgiving. Even a seemingly short distance felt like an eternity when you were exposed to the full force of the elements. In the summer, the sun beat down relentlessly, and choking dust storms could rise up out of nowhere, blinding you and your animals and turning day into night. You'd be tasting grit for days afterward. Then, there was the opposite extreme. A clear blue sky could turn dark in a matter of minutes, unleashing a flash flood that could transform a dry creek bed into a raging torrent. These floods were powerful enough to move boulders and wash away entire sections of a trail, leaving you cut off and isolated. And let's not forget the wildlife. While stories of wolf packs and bears are common, the more persistent threats were things like rattlesnakes, which could be hiding under any rock or bush, delivering a fatal bite far from any hope of medical aid. Beyond the dangers of nature, there were the dangers posed by other people. The West was a vast, largely unpoliced territory, and the isolation of the trails made travelers vulnerable. While the image of masked bandits holding up every stagecoach is an exaggeration, highwaymen and opportunistic thieves were a very real threat. A family traveling alone with a wagon full of supplies was a tempting target. Every stranger you met on the road had to be sized up carefully. Were they a fellow traveler in need of help, or someone looking to take everything you own? Every single trip, whether to town or across the territory, required a mindset of constant vigilance and preparation. You had to plan your route, know where to find water, and carry enough food to last longer than you expected. You had to be a mechanic, a veterinarian, and a navigator all at once. The simple act of moving from point A to point B wasn't a convenience. It was a test of your endurance, your resourcefulness, and your will to keep going when everything seemed to be working against you. It was a journey in every sense of the word. Alright, let's talk about something we all take for granted. Dinner. You get home, you open the fridge, you grab something that's been kept perfectly chilled, and maybe you pop it in the microwave. Easy. But out here, in the Old West, dinner wasn't a convenience. It was a full-time job. And the heart of that operation wasn't a gleaming stainless steel kitchen, but a cast-iron stove, or, more often than not, an open fire. Every single meal started with the fundamental task of creating and managing heat. You didn't just turn a knob, you chopped the wood, you built the fire, and you prayed a sudden gust of wind didn't send a shower of embers onto your tinder-dry wooden floor. It was a constant, smoky, and often thankless battle. The menu? Well, it wasn't exactly a foodie's paradise. Think survival, not scallops. The holy trinity of the frontier diet was beans, bacon, and biscuits. And when I say bacon, I don't mean the crispy strips you get at a diner. I mean salt pork. A fatty, heavily salted cut of meat that could last for months without refrigeration. It was your protein, your fat for cooking, your flavor for everything. You'd find it simmering in a pot of beans all day long or fried up to go with a plate of cornmeal mush. Fresh vegetables were a seasonal treat you grew yourself, and if you didn't have a green thumb or your crop failed, you simply went without. It was a diet of function over form every single day. And don't even get me started on the coffee. It wasn't some fancy artisanal roast. It was often green beans that you had to roast yourself over the fire, grind by hand, and then boil in a pot until it was strong enough to peel the paint off a barn door. It was gritty, it was bitter, and it was absolutely essential. It was the fuel that got you through those pre-dawn chores and bone-chilling nights. Cooking was a labor of love, sure, but mostly, it was just labor. Women spent a huge portion of their day feeding the fire, kneading dough for biscuits, and trying to turn a handful of basic ingredients into something that would fill the bellies of a hungry family. The real challenge wasn't just the cooking, it was the sheer logistics of it all. There was no supermarket down the road. Supplies were hauled in by wagon from towns that could be days away, and they were expensive. Canned goods, a marvel of the age, were a luxury few could afford. So you learned to make do. You learned to preserve. You made jerky from any game you hunted, you pickled any vegetables you managed to grow, and you learned that a barrel of flour and a sack of beans were more valuable than gold, because when the snow started to fall and you were cut off from the rest of the world, that stockpile was the only thing standing between your family and starvation. Now, let's talk about what happens when things go wrong, because out on the frontier, things always went wrong. Your fire goes out in the middle of a rainstorm, hope you like your salt pork raw, a mouse gets into your flour sack, you pick out the droppings, and you keep on baking. Food spoilage wasn't an inconvenience, it was a constant looming threat. Without refrigeration, meat had to be eaten quickly, salted heavily, or smoked and dried into jerky. Milk from the family cow had to be turned into butter or cheese almost immediately. Every scrap of food was precious, and waste was a sin. You learned to use every part of the animal, every last grain of corn. This necessity gave rise to a kind of rugged ingenuity. Pioneer women became masters of preservation. They canned, they pickled, they dried, they salted. They turned summer's bounty into something that could survive the brutal winter months. Hardtack, a simple biscuit made of flour, water, and salt, was a staple for travelers and soldiers for a reason. It was nearly indestructible. You could break a tooth on it, sure, but it wouldn't go bad. It was sustenance in its purest, most unappetizing form. This wasn't about creating delicious heirlooms, it was about survival, plain and simple. It was a dirty, difficult job to keep a family fed when the world seemed determined to let them starve. The tools of the trade were as tough as the people who used them. We're talking heavy black cast iron, Dutch ovens, skillets and griddles that weighed a ton and had to be muscled around a hot fire. These things were prized possessions, often passed down through generations. They held heat like nothing else, and could be used for everything from baking bread to frying meat to boiling water. Cleaning them didn't involve a fancy sponge and dish soap. You used sand or ash to scrub away the grime, then seasoned them with fat to keep the rust away. A well-seasoned cast iron pan was a mark of a well-run household, and through it all, there was a rhythm to it. The daily grind of cornmeal, the slow simmer of beans, the smell of wood smoke clinging to your clothes. It was a world away from our modern lives, where food appears as if by magic. For the pioneers, every meal was a testament to their resilience. It was a victory against the elements, against isolation, against hunger itself. They weren't just cooking, they were building a life, one hard-won, often bland, but deeply appreciated meal at a time. It's a good reminder that the simplest things, like a warm plate of food, are often the result of the hardest work. Think about your morning routine. You stumble into the bathroom, turn a handle, and a torrent of hot, clean water magically appears. It's a miracle we perform every single day without a second thought. But in the Old West, cleanliness was a luxury, and bathing was a full-blown production. It wasn't a daily event. It wasn't even an every other day event. For most folks on the frontier, we're talking once a week, if they were feeling ambitious, maybe once a month when winter set in. The simple act of taking a bath was an exhausting all-day chore that the whole family had to get in on. First, you had to get the water. This wasn't as simple as turning a tap. It meant hauling bucket after heavy bucket from the nearest well, creek, or river, which could be a fair walk from the cabin. Then, you had to heat it. That meant building up the fire and putting every available kettle and pot to work, slowly bringing the water to a temperature that wouldn't give you hypothermia. All this took hours. The centerpiece of this grand event was a wooden or galvanized tin tub, placed right in the middle of the one-room cabin, offering zero privacy. It was a communal affair, whether you liked it or not. And then there was the pecking order. You didn't just fill the tub with fresh, clean water for every person. Are you kidding me? That water was as precious as gold. The whole family used the same tub of water. The man of the house, the patriarch, usually went first, getting the cleanest, hottest water. Then came the other men, then the mother, and then the children, usually from oldest to youngest. By the time the last kid or the baby got their turn, the water was lukewarm, murky, and let's just say, well used. It's the origin of the phrase, "Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater," because by the end, you could barely see the baby. The soap wasn't some fragrant, moisturizing bar from a fancy shop. It was homemade, a harsh concoction of animal fat, usually lard, and lye, which was made from wood ash. It would get you clean, sure, but it would also strip the skin off you if you weren't careful. And toothpaste? Another DIY project. People used crushed charcoal, salt, or baking soda, scrubbing their teeth with a finger or a frayed twig. Deodorant was a concept from a far-off future. The reality of daily life was that everyone had a certain aroma. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't pleasant, but it was a shared reality of a hard life. Now, if you lived in a growing town, you might have had a slightly more civilized option. The public bathhouse. For a few cents, a weary traveler, a dusty cowboy, or a local townsfolk could pay for the unparalleled luxury of a private room with a tub full of hot, clean water. This was the Gilded Age equivalent of a spa day. It was a chance to soak away weeks of trail dust, sweat, and grime. Some bathhouses even offered a shave and a haircut, letting a man emerge feeling like a whole new person. For pioneers living out on the plains, this kind of indulgence was something they could only dream about. But for the vast majority, hygiene was a constant battle against the elements and a lack of resources. Without running water, even simple hand washing was a chore. A basin of water would sit by the door for the whole family to use throughout the day, getting progressively dirtier with each use. Laundry, another Herculean task, was done by hand in that same tub, with that same lye soap, scrubbing clothes on a washboard until your knuckles were raw. Cleanliness wasn't just about comfort, it was about health, but keeping things clean in a world of dirt floors, leaky roofs, and constant dust was a losing fight. Let's not forget the environment they were living in. These weren't sterile, climate-controlled homes. These were cabins made of logs or sod, with dirt floors and roofs that were often home to insects and other critters. Dust was a constant companion, coating every surface. In the summer, the heat and humidity meant sweat was a permanent state of being. In the winter, the cold was so bitter that the idea of stripping down for a bath was downright terrifying. People would go for weeks on end with just a quick wipe down with a damp cloth, if that. It's a level of ripeness that's hard for us to even imagine today. So, the next time you step into a hot shower and complain that the water pressure is a little low, just take a moment. Picture hauling that water by the bucket, heating it over a fire, and then sharing it with your entire family in a drafty cabin. It puts things in perspective. The simple everyday act of being clean is one of the greatest and most overlooked luxuries of the modern world. For the people of the Old West, it was a hard-fought battle, and a clean body was a temporary victory in a very, very dirty job. At the end of a long, grueling day on the frontier, there was one place you could retreat to: home. But forget any image of a charming, spacious log cabin from a movie. The reality was far more cramped, far more primitive, and far more personal. Most frontier homes were brutally simple, often consisting of just 1 or 2 rooms, built by hand with whatever materials were available. If you were in a forested area, you built with logs, painstakingly notching them to fit together. On the treeless prairies, you cut bricks of sod from the earth itself and stacked them like giant grassy blocks to build what was essentially a house made of dirt. These structures were a testament to human grit, but they weren't exactly weatherproof. Roofs, often made of sod, thatch, or rough-hewn shakes, leaked constantly. A heavy rainstorm meant a sleepless night spent strategically placing pots and pans to catch the drips. Floors were often just packed earth which turned to mud when the roof leaked. Insulation was a foreign concept. The gaps between the logs were chinked with a mixture of mud, grass, or moss, which was a constant source of maintenance. It was a never-ending battle to keep the outside. These weren't just houses, they were handmade shelters against a world that was actively trying to get in. And what about sleeping? You weren't sinking into a plush memory foam mattress. Beds were often simple wooden frames with ropes or slats stretched across them. The mattress was a large sack, often called a tick, stuffed with whatever you could find. If you were lucky, it was straw or dried corn husks. If you were less lucky, it was just dried grass or leaves. These materials would compress over time, get buggy, and needed to be emptied and refilled regularly. It was lumpy, it was scratchy, and it was a far cry from a good night's sleep. And yet, after a day of back-breaking labor, it probably felt like heaven. Privacy was the biggest luxury of all, because there was none. In a one-room cabin, the entire family lived, cooked, ate, and slept in the same shared space. Parents and children were separated by nothing more than a hanging blanket, if that. You knew everyone's business because you were living right on top of it. During the brutal winters, this closeness was a matter of survival, with everyone huddling together for warmth. But it meant there was no personal space, no quiet moment alone. Your home was your sanctuary, yes, but it was a sanctuary you shared with everyone you loved all the time. Surviving the night in one of these cabins was its own kind of dirty job. In the winter, the cold was a physical presence. The fire in the hearth would burn down, and the temperature inside the cabin would plummet to near freezing. People slept in their clothes, sometimes even their coats, wrapped in every quilt and animal hide they owned. It wasn't uncommon for a glass of water left out overnight to be frozen solid by morning. You didn't just sleep, you endured the night, hoping the dawn would bring the warmth of the sun and the chance to rebuild the fire. Then came summer. The heat could be just as oppressive as the cold, turning the small, poorly ventilated cabins into ovens. But the real menace was the insects. With no window screens, the nights were a symphony of buzzing mosquitoes, biting flies, and crawling critters of every description. The straw in your mattress was a welcome home for fleas and bedbugs. People would smudge fires with damp grass to create smoke in an attempt to drive the insects away, filling the cabin with an acrid haze. Sleep was a battle, fought nightly against an army of tiny, bloodthirsty invaders. And let's not forget the sounds. The walls of a log or sod house weren't exactly soundproof. You heard everything. The howl of the wind across the plains, a sound that could drive a person mad with its loneliness. the cry of a distant coyote, the rustle of some animals sniffing around the outside of the cabin. Every creak and groan of the wood was amplified in the darkness. You were isolated, miles from your nearest neighbor, and your small, hand-built shelter was the only thing standing between your family and the vast, untamed wilderness. It required a certain kind of courage just to close your eyes. And yet, for all the hardship, these cabins were more than just shelters. They were homes. They were built with the sweat of a family's own labor. Every log and every brick a symbol of their determination to carve out a life. They were the place where children were born, where stories were told around the fire, and where a family came together after a day of toil. They were defended with pride and cherished deeply. It's a powerful reminder that home isn't about the size of the house or the comfort of the mattress. It's about the sanctuary you build, with your own hands, against the storm. Alright, let's talk about something we take for granted every second of every day. Information. Today, news is instant. You get a notification on your phone and you know what's happening on the other side of the planet. But out on the frontier, news traveled at the speed of a tired horse. If you were lucky. Your main connection to civilization, to your family back east, to anything beyond your own property line, was a piece of paper, a letter, and sending one was an act of faith. You'd hand it off to a traveler or a freight driver heading in the right direction and just hope it eventually found its way. You see, there wasn't a mailbox on every corner. There wasn't even a corner. Sending a letter meant waiting for an opportunity, a person, physically moving from your desolate patch of dirt towards a town, any town, that might have a post office. And receiving one, that was an event. Months could pass between sending a letter and getting a reply. Imagine writing to your parents to tell them you'd arrived safely, and by the time you get their response, you've already built a cabin, plowed a field, and survived your first winter. The time lag was immense, a vast, silent gap where anything could happen. This slow, agonizing pace of communication created a profound sense of isolation. You were truly on your own. You couldn't just call for advice or share a quick update. Every decision was made in a vacuum, based on old information. When you said goodbye to loved ones heading west, you understood it might be the last time you ever heard from them. A letter that never arrived could mean anything. It got lost. The recipient moved, or something far worse happened. It was a constant gnawing uncertainty that defined life on the edge of the map, a stark reminder of just how vast and empty the world could feel. And because news was so scarce, it was precious. A traveler passing through was more than just a visitor. They were a living, breathing newspaper. They brought stories, gossip, and updates from the next settlement over or from the cities back east. People would gather around, hanging on every word, trying to piece together a picture of the world from these fragmented second-hand accounts. This wasn't just idle chatter. It was a vital lifeline, a way to feel connected, however tenuously, to the rest of humanity. It was a dirty job, stitching together a sense of reality from whispers and rumors. Then, for a brief, glorious moment, everything changed. In 1860, a legendary service kicked off the Pony Express. Now, this wasn't for your average letter to Aunt Mildred. This was for urgent mail, for business and government dispatches, and it was expensive. But it was revolutionary. Suddenly a message could gallop from St. Joseph, Missouri to Sacramento, California, in about 10 days. 10 days. That was unheard of, a miracle of speed that shrunk the continent. It was a brutal, demanding job for the riders. Young, tough, and willing to risk everything to get the mail through hostile territory and unforgiving weather. These riders were the heroes of their day, embodying the spirit of the West. They faced blizzards, ambushes, and exhaustion, switching horses at relay stations set up every 10 or 15 miles. The whole operation was a masterpiece of logistics and grit, a high-stakes race against time. The mail pouch, or mochila, was slung over the saddle, and the rider's only job was to move. Don't stop, don't get caught, just ride. For 18 months, the Pony Express was the fastest link between East and West, a symbol of American ingenuity and sheer stubborn determination. It was a dirty, dangerous, and utterly essential job, but as fast as the horse was, technology was faster. The Pony Express, for all its romance and glory, was made obsolete almost overnight. The real game changer was the telegraph. As those metal wires were strung across the plains and mountains, they carried messages at the speed of electricity. Suddenly, 10 days seemed like an eternity. With the completion of the first transcontinental telegraph line in 1861, a message could cross the country in minutes. The Pony Express was officially out of a job. It was a classic case of a tough manual job being replaced by a machine. The arrival of the telegraph in a frontier town was a monumental event. It was like plugging the entire community into the national nervous system. Suddenly, you could get stock prices from New York, learn the results of a presidential election the day it happened, or send for help in an emergency. It ended the crushing isolation that had defined frontier life for so long. Of course, you had to get to the telegraph office, and you paid by the word. So, people learned to be concise. But the world was no longer weeks away. It was right there, humming down a wire. If you think communication was slow, try waiting for a doctor. Out on the frontier, professional medical care was a luxury few could afford, and even fewer could find. For the most part, you were your own doctor, pharmacist, and surgeon. The family matriarch was usually the chief medical officer, armed with a collection of folk wisdom, passed down recipes, and a healthy dose of sheer guesswork. Got a cough? A spoonful of whiskey and honey. A bad cut? Slap some turpentine on it and hope for the best. It was a messy, imprecise business, and the line between medicine and poison was often blurry. The family medicine chest wasn't filled with sterile bandages and antibiotics. It was a hodgepodge of questionable substances. You'd find things like opium, often in the form of laudanum, used as a painkiller for everything from teething babies to gunshot wounds. Mercury, a deadly neurotoxin, was a common treatment for syphilis. Castor oil was the go-to solution for, well, just about any internal complaint, a brutal but effective way to cleanse the system. These weren't gentle remedies, they were blunt instruments designed to shock the body into healing, and sometimes they did more harm than good. Everyday ailments that we'd treat with an over-the-counter pill could become life-threatening situations. A simple infection from a splinter could lead to amputation or death. Pneumonia was a death sentence. And childbirth? It was one of the most dangerous things a woman could go through. With no access to proper medical care, complications were often fatal for both mother and child. Families relied on midwives, who had practical experience, but no formal training. It was a world where survival often came down to luck, a strong constitution, and a high tolerance for pain. So you learned to be tough, and you learned to be resourceful. People developed a deep knowledge of local plants and their purported medicinal properties. Poultices were made from bread and milk, or chewed tobacco, to draw out infection. Fevers were fought with cold rags and prayers. It was a constant, grueling battle against an invisible army of germs and bacteria that nobody understood. Getting sick wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a crisis that could threaten the survival of the entire family. It was a dirty, terrifying part of everyday life. When a situation got too dire for home remedies, you might seek out a professional. But that term was used pretty loosely. Doctors were incredibly scarce, and the ones who did practice on the frontier often had dubious credentials. Many were self-taught or had attended a couple of lectures back east before deciding to try their luck out west. They traveled from town to town, their black bag filled with the same questionable concoctions and a few intimidating tools. Setting a broken bone or pulling a rotten tooth was done without anesthetic, relying on a strong belt to bite down on and a few shots of whiskey. And if you couldn't find a doctor, you might go to the next best thing. The barber. That's right, the guy who cut your hair and gave you a shave was often the town's go-to surgeon. The red and white pole outside a barbershop originally symbolized the bloody rags and bandages of the trade. They were known as barber surgeons, and they were the ones you went to for bloodletting, tooth extraction, and even minor amputations. They had sharp razors and a steady hand, and in a world without specialists, that was often good enough. It's a sobering thought, isn't it? Putting your life in the hands of the same guy who just trimmed your sideburns. The concept of sanitation was, to put it mildly, primitive. Germ theory was brand new and not widely accepted. A surgeon might wipe his scalpel on his pants leg before making an incision. The same unwashed hands that had just treated a gangrenous wound might then deliver a baby. Instruments were rarely sterilized, maybe given a quick rinse with alcohol if you were lucky. As a result, post-operative infections were rampant, and often the actual cause of death. You might survive the surgery itself, only to be killed by the germs introduced during the procedure. It was a grim, dirty reality of 19th century medicine. Hospitals were virtually non-existent outside of large, established cities. If you were seriously ill or injured, you were cared for at home. There were no sterile operating rooms, no recovery wards, no trained nursing staff. Your bedroom became the surgical theater and your family members became your nurses. It put an incredible strain on the entire household. The fight for survival wasn't just a personal struggle, it was a communal effort, a messy, exhausting, and often heartbreaking job that everyone had to be prepared to do at a moment's notice. Let's talk about fashion, or more accurately, the complete lack of it. In the Old West, what you wore wasn't a statement, it was a tool. Clothes had to be durable, functional, and capable of withstanding an astonishing amount of abuse. People typically owned very few outfits, maybe one set of clothes for the back-breaking work of running a homestead, and a slightly better set for Sundays, funerals, and weddings. These weren't delicate fabrics, we're talking tough wool, canvas, and early denim. Things that could take a beating, because they were about to get one every single day. For men, a typical outfit consisted of sturdy trousers, a simple shirt, and heavy leather boots. A wide-brimmed hat wasn't a fashion accessory. It was essential protection from the relentless sun and sudden downpours. For women, it was long, heavy dresses, usually made of calico or gingham, worn over multiple layers of petticoats. These weren't designed for comfort or style. They were designed for modesty and durability. Everything was built to last, because getting new clothes was a rare and expensive event. You couldn't just pop over to the mall for a new pair of jeans. Because you only had a few sets of clothes, you wore them until they literally fell apart. And even then, you didn't throw them away. Mending was a constant, necessary chore. A torn shirt would be patched, a hole in a dress would be sewn up. When a garment was too worn out to be repaired, it would be cut up and repurposed. The best parts might be used to patch other clothes, while the scraps would be turned into quilts, rags, or stuffing for dolls. Nothing was wasted. A single shirt could live a dozen lives, ending its days as a cleaning cloth. This meant that by the end of its life, a piece of clothing might be more patch than original fabric. It tells a story of hardship and resourcefulness. Every stain, every patched elbow, every frayed cuff was a testament to the work that had been done while wearing it. These clothes weren't just coverings, they were a record of survival, a map of a hard-lived life. They were practical, they were patched, and they were prized, because in a world of scarcity, a good pair of boots or a sturdy coat was as valuable as gold. If wearing the clothes was tough, cleaning them was a whole other level of dirty job. There were no washing machines, no dryers, no gentle cycle detergents. Laundry day, which was often an entire day, or more, was a grueling, physically demanding ordeal. It started with hauling water, bucket by heavy bucket, from a well or creek. Then, that water had to be heated over an open fire in a massive, heavy cast-iron kettle. Just getting the hot water ready was a workout in itself, a smoky, sweaty, back-breaking task. Once the water was hot, the real work began. Clothes were scrubbed by hand on a grooved washboard. The soap wasn't a nice, scented liquid, it was a harsh, homemade block of lye soap, made from animal fat and wood ash. This stuff was great at cutting through grime, but it was brutal on both the fabric and your hands. You'd scrub and scrub until your knuckles were raw, trying to beat the dust, sweat, and dirt out of the tough material. It was a repetitive, exhausting motion that went on for hours, usually under the hot sun. After scrubbing, the clothes had to be rinsed, which meant more hauling of water. Then came the wringing. Each heavy, waterlogged item had to be twisted by hand to squeeze out as much water as possible. It was a two-person job for heavy items like blankets or canvas trousers. Finally, the clothes were hung out to dry on a line, exposed to the sun, wind, and whatever dust happened to be blowing by. In winter, this was even worse. Clothes would freeze solid on the line and have to be brought inside to thaw, making the small cabin damp and cold. This entire process was so arduous that it wasn't done very often. You didn't just toss a shirt in the wash after one wear. People wore their clothes for days, even weeks, between washings, especially work clothes. You can just imagine the aroma. It gives you a new appreciation for that fresh laundry smell, doesn't it? It wasn't just a pleasant scent, it was the smell of a monumental amount of hard physical labor. It was one of the dirtiest, most thankless jobs on the homestead, and it was absolutely essential. Alright, let's talk about shopping. Today you click a button and a drone drops a package on your doorstep. Back then, shopping was an event, a pilgrimage, the centerpiece of your entire week, maybe even your month. The general store wasn't just a place to buy stuff. It was the nerve center of the entire community. It was the post office, the bank, the social club, and the only place for 100 miles where you could get a barrel of nails, a bolt of fabric, and the latest gossip all in one stop. You didn't just pop in for a carton of milk. You hitched up the wagon, planned your day, and hoped the creek wasn't running too high to cross. When you finally walked through that door, the smell would hit you first. A wild combination of leather, coffee beans, cured tobacco, lamp oil, and maybe a hint of pickle brine from an open barrel. There were no aisles to wander, no neatly organized shelves with price tags. Everything was behind a long wooden counter, stacked to the ceiling in what looked like organized chaos. Barrels of flour, sugar, and salt lined the floor. Bolts of calico and denim were piled high. Tools, harnesses, and horse tack hung from the rafters. You didn't browse. You came with a list, a very specific list, and you waited your turn to give it to the storekeeper. The man behind the counter was more than just a clerk. He was a pillar of the community. He knew everyone's name, their kids' names, and probably how much credit they had left. When you asked for 5 pounds of flour, he wouldn't hand you a pre-packaged bag. He'd grab a scoop, walk over to a massive barrel, and weigh it out for you right there on a big cast iron scale. Need some fabric for a new dress? He'd unroll a heavy bolt onto the counter and cut it with a pair of hefty shears. It was a personal, hands-on transaction, a world away from the anonymous beep of a modern scanner. This system was built on trust and necessity. The storekeeper had to trust you'd pay your bill, and you had to trust that his scales were honest and his goods were fresh, or at least as fresh as they could be after a long journey by wagon or rail. For many families living way out on the plains, a trip to the general store was their only real connection to the wider world. It was where they got news, supplies, and a much-needed dose of human interaction before heading back out to the quiet solitude of their homestead for another few months. It wasn't just shopping, it was a lifeline. Now paying for these goods wasn't always as simple as pulling a few coins from your pocket. Cash was a scarce commodity on the frontier. Many transactions were done through barter, a direct trade of goods and services. A farmer might bring in a crate of fresh eggs, a few pounds of butter churned that morning, or a cured ham to trade for sugar, coffee, and ammunition. The storekeeper became a master of valuation, figuring out exactly how many eggs a new shovel was worth, or how much fabric a bushel of corn could buy. It was a complex dance of supply, demand, and good old-fashioned negotiation. Because trips to town were so infrequent and arduous, you couldn't just buy what you needed for the week. You had to think in terms of months, sometimes even an entire season. People bought in bulk. We're talking 100-pound sacks of flour, 20-pound sacks of sugar, and massive tins of coffee. You didn't buy a box of nails, you bought a whole keg. These supplies had to last through blizzards, floods, and whatever else the frontier decided to throw at you. Running out of something essential like salt or lamp oil wasn't an inconvenience. It was a genuine crisis that could put your family's survival at risk. Imagine loading all of that onto your wagon. Heavy sacks of grain, barrels of salted pork, crates of canned goods, if you could afford them. Then, you had the long, slow journey home. Every bump in the road, every river crossing, was a risk. A broken axle, or a spooked horse, could leave you stranded miles from anywhere, with a wagon full of precious supplies. You weren't just carrying groceries, you were hauling your family's future. That sack of flour wasn't just for bread, it was a guarantee of survival through the long, cold winter ahead. For folks living in the most isolated areas, the general store wasn't even an option. Instead, they relied on traveling peddlers, who would arrive in wagons loaded down with everything from pots and pans to patent medicines and sewing needles. These visits were a major event, a chance to get goods you couldn't make yourself and hear news from the outside world. Whether it was the town store or a peddler's wagon, getting supplies was a deliberate, challenging, and absolutely vital part of life. It's a job, a real dirty job, just to keep your pantry full. You might think that with all the backbreaking labor, the constant threat of danger, and the sheer difficulty of just staying alive, folks in the Old West didn't have time for fun, but you'd be wrong. In fact, because life was so hard, finding moments of joy and relaxation was essential. It wasn't about extravagant entertainment, it was about creating your own. In the quiet evenings, after the chores were done and the sun went down, families would gather together. Someone would pull out a fiddle or a harmonica, and the cabin would fill with music. These weren't professional musicians. They were farmers and cowboys playing tunes passed down through generations. Storytelling was another huge part of frontier entertainment. With no television, no radio, and often no books, people became masters of the spoken word. They'd share family histories, ghost stories, tall tales, and jokes around the fire. It was how they passed the time, how they taught lessons, and how they kept their culture and traditions alive in the vast, empty wilderness. For children, fun was even simpler. They didn't have toy stores or video games. Their playground was the world around them, and their toys were whatever they could find or make themselves. A simple game of marbles, played with clay or glass spheres in the dirt, could keep kids occupied for hours. They played stickball, a rough-and-tumble ancestor of baseball, using a carved branch for a bat and a ball made of wound-up rags. On a hot summer day, the local creek or swimming hole was the best place in the world, a place for splashing, swimming, and escaping the relentless sun. Imagination was the most important toy a child could have. A simple corn husk doll could become a beloved companion, and a carved wooden horse could lead epic adventures across the prairie. These simple pleasures were the glue that held families and communities together. A barn raising wasn't just about work. It was a social event that ended with a huge feast and a dance that lasted late into the night. Quilting bees brought women together to work with their hands, but also to share stories, advice, and laughter. These moments of shared joy were a powerful antidote to the isolation and hardship of frontier life. It was a reminder that even in the toughest of circumstances, people will always find a way to laugh, to sing, and to connect with one another. When you got into town, the entertainment options expanded, though they were still a far cry from what we know today. For many men, the center of social life was the saloon. Sure, it was a place for drinking, and sometimes for trouble, but it was much more than that. It was a place to unwind after a long cattle drive, to play a game of cards, and to catch up with old friends. Most saloons had a piano player banging out popular tunes, and the air was thick with smoke, conversation, and the sound of clinking glasses. It was a rough, boisterous form of community, but it was community nonetheless. Of course, saloons weren't for everyone. For more respectable entertainment, towns often had a small theater or an opera house. These weren't grand gilded halls, they were often simple wooden buildings. But when a traveling troupe of actors or a singer came to town, it was a massive event. People would come from miles around dressed in their Sunday best to see a real, live performance. It was a taste of culture, a brief escape from the dust and toil of their everyday lives. For a few hours, they could be transported to another world, and that was a powerful thing. Even more exciting was the arrival of a traveling circus or a medicine show. These were spectacles on wheels, rolling into town with promises of amazing feats, exotic animals, and miraculous cures. A man in a top hat would stand on a wagon hawking elixirs that promised to cure everything from baldness to boredom, while acrobats and musicians drew in a crowd. It was pure showmanship, a bit of flash and dazzle in a world that was often very gray and brown. People knew most of it was humbug, but they didn't care. It was fun, it was different, and it was something to talk about for weeks afterward. Ultimately, entertainment in the Old West was about making the most of what you had. It was about finding joy in the simple things. A shared song, a good story, a community gathering. Whether it was a dance in a neighbor's barn, a game of poker in a smoky saloon, or the rare treat of a traveling show, these moments of fun were not a luxury. They were a necessity. They were what gave people the strength to face another day of hard work, to endure the hardships, and to keep building their lives on the rugged, unforgiving frontier. It was hard-earned fun, and maybe that's what made it so sweet. So, there you have it. A look at life before everything got so easy. In the Wild West, every single day was a challenge, a test of your will, your strength, and your ingenuity. But it was also a testament to what people are capable of. From the dirty job of hauling water for a once-a-month bath, to the monumental task of building a home with your own two hands, settlers did everything the hard way. They didn't have a choice. And in the process, they didn't just survive. They laid the foundation for the country we know today. They built a nation while doing it. Think about it. The next time you flush a toilet, flick on a light switch, or grab a snack from the fridge, just take a second. Remember the folks who lived without any of it. The ones who used corn cobs and chamber pots, who cooked over an open fire, who considered a trip to the general store a major expedition. Their world was one of real consequences, where a simple mistake could be your last. Life in the Old West wasn't easy, not by a long shot. There was nothing glamorous about it. But it was real. It was raw. It was a life lived without a safety net, where your own grit and the help of your neighbors were the only things you could truly count on. It's a world that's gone now, replaced by convenience and comfort, and while I wouldn't trade my indoor plumbing for an outhouse in a blizzard, there's a part of me that respects the hell out of the people who lived that life. It's an unforgettable chapter of our story, one filled with hardship, yes, but also with incredible resilience and an unbreakable human spirit. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? When you strip away all the modern conveniences, all the things we take for granted, what are you left with? The people of the Old West found out every single day. They faced the dirt, the danger, and the endless work, and they endured. They built something that lasted. So, the question I'll leave you with is a simple one, but it's not an easy one. Would you have survived the frontier? Really think about it. Would you?